Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone here today to our colloquium. I have the honor of introducing our speakers today. We have Dr. Christopher Blair, who received his PhD in Cognitive and Brain Sciences at the University of Nevada, Reno. He completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. He is currently in his second year of teaching here at EOU and moved here with his wife, Jennifer Renee Blair. In his free time, he enjoys singing, reading, and video gaming. We also have Dr. Robert Butler. He graduated with a doctorate in child clinical psychology from Auburn University. He did an internship at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center and taught for 4 years at King's College in Pennsylvania. This is his 3rd year teaching at EOU, and he is married to Trina Macbeth Butler, and they have 5 amazing children. They love living in Eastern Oregon, and his hobbies are basketball, racquetball, and gardening. Last but not least at all is Dr. Ette Newman Conadera. She graduated as a dual major from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh in early childhood special education and elementary education, pre-K through grade 3. Upon graduation, she moved to Las Vegas and accepted a position as an early childhood teacher working with children diagnosed with autism. During this time, in collaboration with the Clark County School District and Autism Partnership, Ette's classroom was recognized as the early childhood model classroom for the district. After 3 years, Ette transitioned to teach pre-kindergarten at the same elementary school in the Clark County School District. She completed her master's in special education from University of Nevada, Las Vegas with a concentration in autism and cognitive disabilities and her PhD in special education. She's in her 6th year here at EOU. She's a lot of things in the College of Education. Including the coordinator for the Early Childhood Program, the MAT program, and one of the co-directors for Teacher Prep in the College of Education. She's married and has a 2-year-old daughter named Lily, and in her free time, she enjoys playing with Lily, watching Harry Potter, and relaxing. So please welcome our presenters.
Thank you. So we just want to acknowledge also Dylan Chavez. He's not able to be here and present with us, but he was one of our co-researchers, and one of the students in the psychology program, in the online program actually, so kind of fun that he's actively engaging in research from a distance. Okay, so our presentation today, we're going to go over CAPSI, and what CAPSI is computer-assisted or computer-aided personalized system of instruction, and it's an old way of teaching that's kind of being made new with the onset of technology. But we'll get into that more in a little bit. So first, we just want to give you a few numbers and some background as to why this is important. So currently at Eastern Oregon University, on average, 80% of our students are taking at least one distance education course while they're here. And if you look at the most recent term, we had 16,432 student credit hours on campus. And in the online programs, we had 13,836. So we're pretty close to that 50% mark. And that's been fairly consistent for the last several years that we're about a 50-50 split. So a lot of our students are in this distance education space. Now, I wasn't able to find EOU-specific data, but if you look at distance education programs in general, what we tend to see is that although they're wonderful in some ways, so you have things like increased accessibility and also decreases in costs when you do the distance education. Some of the difficulties that come with distance education is that there's a body of research suggesting that these students actually don't learn quite as much. Once they're done with their degree, they're somewhere between 1/3 to 1/4 of a standard deviation in their knowledge content lower than on-campus students, which if you look at percentages, that's about 9 to 13% less knowledge. So pretty big problem there, 9 to 13% less learning. Also, when you look at retention rates, they go down. Now, the difficulty in knowing, is this because the type of student who's taking distance education, or is it actually because of the education model? But also, both things that we don't want to see. So, the point of what we were doing was trying to find a way that could increase our students' engagement in online courses, increase how much they're learning, and help them just be more engaged with the class in general. One of the big things that we talk about in distance education is instructor presence. And instructor presence is all those things that you don't have to work at in an on-campus class, right? All those interactions with the students, all those conversations with the students before and after class, getting them feedback, all these different things are just so natural in the in-person environment. But when it becomes an online environment, all those things have to be thought out. And you have to think about how am I going to increase my interactions with these students so they actually feel a connection with me as a professor instead of just someone out there in the distance, right? And there are a lot of different things that can increase instructor presence. So those things are things like increased number of emails, recording video lectures with actual video and audio instead of just having material available to students, giving the students increased feedback and more feedback more often, right? And this isn't part of this study, but one thing I've done this year is I've started requiring my students to actually do a Google Hangout with me so we actually get to talk face-to-face at 2 points during the course, right? So all those things can improve the instructor presence. Okay, so when we have improved instructor presence, we see a lot of good things in our distance education students. We see things like they're more engaged, they achieve more, they learn more, they graduate at higher rates, and they tend to be more satisfied with their education. So one model that we're studying in this presentation and that we'd like to share with you is what's called CAPSI, the Computer-Assisted, Computer-Aided Personalized System of Instruction. But to understand that, we figured it was easiest to just go back to the original model, the personalized system of instruction. And this is a really nice way in the online setting where we can increase that instructor presence and that interaction with those interactions with the students. So the personalized system of instruction also goes by mastery learning, okay? And it began back in, the big movement started in the 1960s with two individuals. You had Carroll and Keller. And Keller kind of ended up being the one who got more of the spotlight. So to understand PSI, it's useful to kind of know a little bit of the history of where this came from. Keller was colleagues with B.F. Skinner, right? And all that behaviorism. And Keller's idea was that we could use those same principles that Skinner was seeing in changing rat behavior and human behavior in the classroom to increase student learning. And so began with Keller and Carroll. Let's see. And one of the key ideas of personalized system of instruction is that any student can learn if they're given certain things. And those things are, one, enough time. The second thing is sufficient instruction, so multiple opportunities to learn. And let's see, sufficient instruction, and lots of support from their instructors. All right, turn it over to Chris.
Look like in principle in these courses. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to take the information that's available to your course and sort of break it down into manageable chunks. Depending on the topic, this might be each chapter is its own chunk, or you might have to break chapters into various chunks. But either way, get the material down to a level where these are sort of bite-sized manageable units for the students to work with. Now, as students are going along and working with these units, you're going to have various means of assessment, and the students need to be receiving sort of immediate feedback on any of those assessment measures. Generally speaking, they'll have things like quizzes or whatnot the students will take, testing their knowledge of that particular unit. And as soon as they finish the quiz, through some means or another, they should get feedback. It's like, okay, these are the questions that you got wrong. These are why you got them wrong, and sort of with the goal of saying, and this is what you can do in order to improve on this, to sort of urge them to go and restudy that same material. And as part of this restudying, the students have lots of learning opportunities, whereas obviously in just sort of our standard course, there's the book, there's your notes. If you had a problem, go back and read your book, look at your notes again. But the idea with PSI is that you have additional materials that the students can turn to at this point, that you have other handouts that you might make for them. You might direct them to other studies or other literature that are related to it, again, depending on what the course is and what materials are actually available. So, and as part of this assessment, this sort of goes back and forth within a unit until the student actually reaches a certain level of mastery. So let's say that they finish chapter 1, they take a quiz on it, they don't do so great, You give them feedback about what they missed. You give them these additional materials that are related to the information in Chapter 1. They go back and study them. They come back. They take another quiz on Chapter 1. And you sort of repeat this process until the student reaches sort of a certain level of mastery, as we say. Usually the students have to demonstrate that they're able to get 80% correct on whatever sort of assessment you have for that particular unit before they can move on to additional material. So again, if you haven't mastered it, we're not going to pile any more on you until you have. And also along with this, which is probably already becoming sort of obvious, is that this is sort of a self-paced method. Now, in the way that I've been describing it, it helps for those students that are having difficulty with material. They can theoretically take as much time as they need on any particular unit to master that material, just keep going back and forth. But on the other hand, for those students that are not having difficulty with the material, this self-pacing means that they can learn much more in a shorter period of time if that's what they want to do and they're showing that capability and they have that capacity to master the material more quickly. So obviously some potentially good things about PSI here. But PSI sort of, again, came about in the 1960s, sort of peaked in use around the 1970s and the 1980s, but then it started to fall out of favor at that point. As you probably can tell, this is a very time-intensive method for the instructor, potentially speaking, especially in the way that this was being implemented at the time. You always had to have somebody available to administer the assessments and to give feedback to the students whenever they wanted to do it. You had to have these materials ready and on hand and be ready to give them to the students whenever they asked for them. So all that sort of thing put a lot of pressure on the creators and the administrators of this courses, in addition to, of course, just making all of these assessment materials. Also, it's a very different sort of process, and as we know, we all tend to fear change to one degree or another, so there's always going to be pushback in that realm. It was actually forbidden at certain institutions. There were complaints from students that they felt like their professors weren't actually teaching them anything. Because of course, with this being self-paced back in the time, especially before we had video lectures or things like that, the professor couldn't really just lecture the class as they normally would because students are learning whatever chapter they happen to be on at a particular time. It didn't make sense for the professor to come up and stick to a particular schedule. So all the material they were getting was given to them by the professor. They might have written that material, they might have found it, sort of curated it, but they themselves were not teaching in front of the classroom. And again, some students were complaining, well, what am I paying for if this professor's not actually teaching me? And at the end of the day, as you can guess, not everybody implemented PSI as it was originally intended. Again, there's a lot of sort of demanding things in that list I gave on the previous slide, and people tried to sort of modify it to see if they could fit it within the strictures of a more sort of traditional university environment. And what the research showed is whenever people did this, the efficacy of PSI went way down, and it wasn't really helpful to the students, and they might as well have just stuck with sort of their standard lecture model or whatever they were using previously. So again, one of the biggest drawbacks potentially to PSI is that if the idea is that students can take as long as they need to master this material, how are you supposed to fit that into a semester or a term structure? Obviously, it just doesn't fit with that, which brings up issues of how much do you charge students? If they take longer than a term or a semester to finish the course, do they get charged for another semester? If they take a shorter period of time, should they be paying the same amount as some students? And all these questions sort of came up and again made PSI a bit less popular, especially in the university environment. All right. And again, generally speaking, and for some of the same reasons, it just wasn't always feasible from a resource or economic perspective. Again, does the professor actually have the time? How long should they continue if you just have that one student that's taking, 2, 3, 4 years to master a single concept? Can the professor really spend that much time just on that one student?
So you can kind of hear how and why PSI went out of the educational strategies that were being used. But again, as we move forward and with the use of technology or virtual teaching, you can see how the revitalization of PSI has come back as computerized, personalized systems of learning now. So that's what's actually what CAPSI is the computerized part of it. So again, there's many limitations that PSI were aided with when CAPSI came into play. One of them is the multiple educational opportunities. So when students are in your class and you're doing this face-to-face, you have to provide all of these different learning opportunities. You have to have these handouts. You have to have the readings. You need to be available in order to answer all these questions when there are questions. Well, this is aided by the use of a computer, because when we have things on such as Canvas, you are available 24/7. They can always go back to those resources that are provided in your module. So you have your readings in there, you have videos, you have additional supplementary videos not provided by the instructor. You have outlines that are available 24/7 to our students. So you can see how this really evened out and made it a little bit easier for this strategy to be utilized with our classrooms. There are multiple assessments. So students are always going to be able to take those assessments over and over until they show mastery. And by doing that, you're making sure that your students actually understand the concept versus reaching half of our students or a third of our students before moving on to that next piece. We're really reaching all of our students because they have to reach that minimum threshold of achievement before they can move on with that into the next module. Feedback is automated. Just like we have in Canvas right now with our system, the feedback is automatic. You type it into the system. When they answer a response incorrectly, it gives them additional feedback. And they utilize that feedback immediately when they go and take that next assessment again. So you can see how it's really speeding up that process of waiting for an instructor to provide that feedback. It's just it's automated and automatic. The accessibility for students enhances that self-pacing. It is not a class that happens from 4 to 5 p.m. It is available to them 24/7. So it's just really simple for the students to access it and move through the course as they can. You can see how a student may complete a course within 2 or 3 weeks. They could complete it in a weekend if they had all of that time. So it's really available to the students when they have the time to complete that course versus a specified time they need to be on campus in a classroom. The last one, it's the automation resulting in more students served. Because there's no classroom or there's a certain amount of students that have to be in a classroom, you can reach a broader variety of students in your classroom because your classroom is not 4 walls, it is virtual. So the current findings, you're going to see that numerous studies have found CAPSI to lead to increased learning compared to other teaching modalities. However, there are also studies that have found CAPSI to be equivalent or inferior to other models. So it's very inconsistent as to how this model is coming out. So that's where we stepped in and said, we're going to figure out how it works best in regards to our courses.
So when you look at the current state of the research for CAPSI, there's some really exciting things coming out. And the majority of the research is quite positive, finding that students who are doing a CAPSI model are learning more than students in other methods. But there's some major limitations in that research, as there always is, especially when we first get started. And one of the big limitations when you look at these studies looking at CAPSI is that they're not really doing what I would consider a fair comparison. They're taking, say, a traditional in-person lecture course, and sometimes in the study they'll compare that to a fully automated online distance education course and try to draw conclusions there. Sometimes they'll do an in-person course and then compare it to a hybrid course that's in-person and partially CAPSI online, and it's this hybrid thing, so not really a fair comparison there either. And then the other place that we see a lot of research being done is just with a one-shot, let's do one assignment type thing. If we give students a traditional lecture and then an assignment, and then in this other group of students, we'll do this CAPSI model for one assignment and see how they do, well, that really doesn't get the whole breadth of what CAPSI is either. So although these studies are finding encouraging data, we couldn't find a single study that has said, is CAPSI superior to other distance education-based courses? If you take a course that is fully online with video lectures that's already up and running and doing well, and then compare that to a CAPSI course that is fully online, is CAPSI going to be better? So that was what our primary question was when we approached this study. The other thing to mention is that when you look at the studies and the effectiveness of CAPSI, a lot of it comes down to the modality of what's being assessed. So if you're using CAPSI and then you assess it by looking at content knowledge and how much the students have learned, CAPSI looks really good. In the few studies that have then looked at more of a writing-based course, where they're looking to see if students become better writers when you use CAPSI, most of those studies aren't encouraging. And there's a lot of possible reasons why this isn't as effective with writing. Some of the authors are suggesting that the reason this isn't effective with writing is that the students are actually learning more content, but if their writing skills aren't improving, they can't get across that they know more content. Another thing with the writing piece is that the one study that we were able to find that wasn't actually a CAPSI study, it was back when it was still PSI, that found positive effects for writing. I don't know what professor had time to do this, but they did a full-blown PSI model with writing where they took their students' writing, gave them feedback multiple times on every piece of writing, gave them back that feedback until they met what they considered was good enough. And then, and they did find that those students in that PSI course with writing had better outcomes. But in general, the studies with CAPSI used with writing find that their writing's not getting better unless that's actually the focus of what the CAPSI is about. So just like, it just looks like it might just be effective for content. Okay. All right. Am I doing the hypothesis? Oh. Go and pass off the mic too quick. All right, so our hypotheses. We have 5 different hypotheses that we were evaluating. Our first hypothesis was kind of the obvious, straightforward, that CAPSI would be superior to these other distance education courses. Okay, so that was our hypothesis 1. Our hypothesis 2 was basically that the CAPSI would be better for the content-driven courses than the writing-based courses, as previous research has suggested. Hypothesis 3, that our students will not just have more content knowledge, but this CAPSI model would lead to fewer dropouts and fewer withdrawals from the course. So we'd also see benefits in retention. Okay. Hypothesis 4, students who do CAPSI will report that they're more engaged with the course. And we looked at course engagement in terms of time studied, how motivated they were, how much they procrastinated, right? So some of those key engagement measures. And then the last hypothesis is that the students who were in the CAPSI course would report that they preferred CAPSI to traditional video lecture distance education courses. All right, now I'm passing it on. All right.
Nope.
Oh, it's still me. Man, I'm just going to talk forever. Okay, so the current design. We did a between subjects design. So what we did is each of us had a course that we had already taught in the distance education setup. And each of these courses, we had already included video lectures. So we want to make these courses as good as we could. They all had all these good components that should lead to good student engagement in them. So we took our original courses, and then we modified them to be CAPSI for the next go-around. So unfortunately, we clearly could not do a randomization. We couldn't randomly assign students to the various courses. But these are the 3 courses that we looked at. So you can probably guess from who's presenting, whose courses these are, right? So the first one, there's Ette's course, looking at the education side. But then for Chris and I both being in the psychology department, we want to look at as many kind of content areas as we could to see if CAPSI is effective across content areas. In previous research, and I should have already mentioned this, most of those studies were done with just one content area. So what makes this unique is we're looking at the effectiveness of CAPSI across 3 content areas. So we took my statistics course, which is probably the furthest one out there within the psychology field that's the most different, right? And then Chris took his research methods class. We also had to modify CAPSI because unfortunately terms come to an end. And we can't just grade forever and we can't give half the class incompletes and just keep going, right? So how we modified CAPSI, and this is a pretty standard modification that's been used in the past, is students only had up to 3 attempts on each unit of material. So once we broke down our material into very manageable units, for Chris and Ette, they did chapters at a time. For stats, I broke it down further because they kind of need that in the stats realm, so 2 to 3 units per chapter. But once we broke it down to those small units, they then could read the chapter, they could watch a lecture, then they take a quiz and see if they could reach a mastery standard. We set our mastery standard at 80% or better. There's argument in the literature over what's the best percentage, but we set ours at 80%. And And then if the students reached 80%, they were good to go. They could just continue on through the course and move on. If they didn't reach that 80%, they were encouraged to go back and study more, so we gave them many, many opportunities to learn. And also they had to wait an hour between attempts. So you couldn't just sit down at your computer, take a quiz, take the next quiz, take the next quiz. It had to be at least an hour break between. Unfortunately, Canvas doesn't set that up really nice for you. There's not that option to do it, so threats of zeros on assignments unless you do this right were used. And, and usually the students, after they got the first email saying, you did this wrong, you have to wait an hour between attempts or you get a zero, shaped up and got it, okay? So they had to repeat it, but they could only do it up to 3 times. If they didn't reach the mastery criterion after 3 attempts, they just moved on to the next unit because we have time restraints. Also, the other thing with our modifications that we did that is not pure CAPSI is we gave them deadlines of where they should be, okay? So it's not fully self-paced, but with the deadlines, we gave them flexibility. So here's the target date of where you should be on content by this date, but then we gave them up to a week after that date to finish that unit. So they had that flexibility built in, but it had to be done within a week of the target date, or they couldn't do that. So that was our way of modifying it to make it fit within the academic calendar. This has already been mentioned. The online realm's great for giving immediate feedback, so all the quizzes can just be automated, right? And with huge test banks that are available to us now, it's much easier to make these multiple assessments. Okay, I think that's it.
That's officially
Now I
it.
pass it off. There you go.
So I used CAPSI for my ECED 417, which is Introductions to Individuals' Exceptionalities in Early Childhood. The learning materials that were provided within each of the different modules was the required reading or the chapter. They also had video lectures from myself regarding the topic. They had additional videos as well as could be found. And then they also had a written review provided by myself of what the previous chapter and what the new chapter was going to be about. So we were really trying to meet all the different modalities that our students learn using. Some other additional resources that aren't up there is I did provide them with some outlines of the material as well, so they could really follow along and see how the chapters were progressing. What's really nice about this book is that each chapter is set up the exact same. They have an introduction, definition, what it looks like, and then some accommodations that can be made for these types of students, or these students with disabilities. So it really helped students really see and utilize how the book was structured. As Robert said, my course was set up by topic as by chapter, so it was just how the chapters developed and run through the book. And then my assessments. I call my quizzes celebrations of knowledge, because they should never be a surprise. They should be a celebration of what you know. So we had celebrations of knowledge every week. And then they had 2 major projects that were due. During the 8th week, they had to turn in a book review. And then during their finals week, they had an Exceptionalities brochure that was due. And these projects are the same if it was for my CAPSI course or if it was for my online course. Something you need to also know about the Early Childhood program is all of our courses are online. It's an online program. So our students are very fluent in how these early childhood courses run. So this was nothing new except for the different types of materials they received and the fact that it was self-paced. Otherwise, all of the courses are very much set on a weekly schedule. Okay. I should also say that the early childhood, this course is a writing course, so this is where the writing piece will come in later.
All right, so as we already said, I taught the research methods course. Again, not a lot of new information here. They had their textbook that was a required reading, and then there were 2 lectures per chapter that were provided to them in the form of videos. And then in addition to that, there were various videos on different topic areas where I thought that they might need help, so a few for each chapter. And like Ette, I broke mine into chapters. It's a pretty thin book, 3-credit course. You can probably read one of these chapters in less than an hour, so fairly bite-sized. And the organization of it is such that, especially once you get past sort of the basic concept chapters, you're having like one research method or one research approach per chapter. So again, sort of keeping it into these self-contained sort of units. So as far as assessments went, in the previous course, I had sort of a weekly activity that the students did. It was a mixture of multiple choice and short answer sort of activities. And what I did for the CAPSI thing is I sort of took these activities, broke off basic content into the quizzes that we used for CAPSI, you know, sort of covering a little bit of all the chapter, but then kept sort of the application part of that, kept those sort of short answer assignments to make sure that the students are not, you know, just sort of rote memorization of these concepts. And so it was roughly the same amount of content between the two different versions of the courses, just sort of separated into this multiple attempt, multiple choice quizzes versus these short answer assignments. And then the exams, there were 3 unit exams, so for each third of the course there was an exam, and these exams were exactly the same for both classes to sort of offer that point of comparison. There was only one attempt on each exam regardless of the course.
All right. So for the stats course, very similar to what you've already heard, but with stats, practice is essential, doing the procedures over and over again. So there's a lot more of that in my extended opportunities for my students to learn. So I had a website that was associated with the textbook where they could go to practice stats multiple times. I filmed every single statistical procedure. I did it 3 different times for them, walking them through every single step. I found YouTube videos of other professors teaching the same thing, so they had that. And then also, there were multiple practice problems with the correct answers and the steps for how to get to that correct answer written out. So they could read the question, do it, then look at the procedure of how they should have gotten to the right answer. Then, so this is a lot of work on the front end, right, to get it set up. But the other thing that I did for them to have multiple opportunities to practice is that they also had a study guide with key components with additional questions of where they go with those key components. So they have all these different things for them to learn. Again, the big difference with the stats one, though, is we broke it down into even smaller units of learning in the hopes that they get those really small units so we could actually get to the full statistical procedure. And that brings me to one thing that I probably should have already mentioned. One of the big criticisms of previous research on PSI and CAPSI both is that if you give students multiple opportunities to do well, of course their performance is going to go up, just by the chance, right? If you take the same test 3 different times, well, they're using different quizzes each time is one piece, but then we want to see if our students actually have learned more by the end of this procedure. So what we did is we each selected key assignments or key assessments that we used that were identical between both courses, and the students could only attempt those key assessments once. So in the stats course, there were 5 exams, and the exams they can only do 1 time. They couldn't do those 3 times, and there was a comprehensive final. So we're going to get to our results right now, and when we talk about those comparisons, the numbers are all from those key assignments. None of them are from these repeated 3 attempts. Okay, so they only have 1 shot on this.
All right, so I'm covering what we call the objective measures of our hypotheses, and Ette will be covering our subjective material. No, I kid. So our first hypothesis, of course, just the overall effectiveness of CAPSI. Do we see improvements in students' learning in the CAPSI course versus the traditional? Well, if you actually run the ANOVA on the data from all 3 courses, that is definitely a big fat no, unfortunately. But you can probably see some definite trending here that might explain why we're not finding that effect. In the case of both statistics and research methods, we're seeing an appreciable bump in the average percentage that we're getting on those key assessments, whereas in the education course, in the writing-based course, it looks like we might actually be seeing the opposite trend. So that also led us to our second hypothesis, and in this case, we combined the data from the 2 content-based courses, the statistics and the research methods, partially again because they're sort of more similar in the means of assessment and teaching, but also since they were already showing the same sort of trend within the data, we figured, you know, it just makes sense. We're not compounding our error. So in making this comparison here, while again we're still not seeing an overall significant effect of CAPSI, we are seeing a significant interaction here, which does suggest that we are seeing a benefit of CAPSI in the content-based courses. We're just seeing that opposite or no trend within the writing-based courses. And then finally, our third hypothesis as to whether or not the failure and withdrawal rates would be lower in CAPSI. That did appear to be the case within the statistics course, but maybe not so much within the methods course. The education course seemed to be staying at about the same level.
So one of the other pieces that we did is we had our students who participated in the CAPSI complete a survey and provide us with information on how they felt going through this process. So you can see our survey demographics on the top, and then you can see the means that were provided there. I'm not really a table person, I'm much more of a graph person, and I think this says a lot as to what our students felt about the CAPSI. So as you can see, in preference, satisfaction, motivation, and in time spent studying, which is really exciting, you can see in all of these areas, our students actually added time to what was done in the other courses, or in a typical face-to-face, or in the other CAPSI course, or excuse me, other online courses. Two areas that showed a really big decrease were in procrastination and stress. So in the areas we wanted to increased. In the areas that we want to decrease, including procrastination, because that's a really bad thing in online courses, because if they procrastinate, they tend to miss the deadlines. It went down. And it went down in all of our courses, or went up in all of our courses respectively. So as you can see, CAPSI worked out really well in regards to how our students felt CAPSI worked. And then the last two hypotheses have to do with student class preference by type. And as you can see, all of our students in all of our classes really appreciated the CAPSI courses. So when we're thinking about what does this mean for us, how do we move forward, as you can see, all of our students really appreciate being able to have that accessibility to self-pace through their course. Interestingly, there are a couple who thought online only with self-directed reading was going to be very helpful, so that's very interesting. Some more research could be done there with a couple students who indicated that. But also those online with video lectures. So as you can see, CAPSI is very much appreciated by all of our students in all three of our programs. So just discussion and implications for what we learned about the CAPSI in our study. It improved learning in all the content-driven courses. I would also say it improved the content in the writing course as well. Again, I had the writing course, so I'm going to talk about that in just a second. With the comparison of the writing based to CAPSI, it did not demonstrate improved learning. And some of the reasons for that, I think, as you looked at those two graphs, when we think of writing throughout the entire term and getting feedback, when you're getting feedback every single week on writing type skills, you'd anticipate that that would go up over time. So when we took that away versus the students still did get that feedback. It was from myself and students throughout the entire program, but they weren't getting grades based on that. So that could be one of the reasons why we see that decrease over time, that they just didn't have that motivational support per se, because there was no grade associated with that. And also, when you look at points, students are also getting points for their writing ability, where in content-based, they're not getting points on that content. So they have real content knowledge, but their writing is still poor, so they may have a decrease in their scores that way. So that's one of the reasons why I think the scores, our outcome is the way it is. Students in all CAPSI courses indicated an increase in satisfaction, the motivation, the time spent studying, and the preference in this type of a course, and a decrease in the procrastination and stress. Again, everything that we as educators want to go up went up. The negative effects went down. Although PSI is not feasible in face-to-face, CAPSI may lead to superior outcomes for distance education courses. It really has a lot to do with the planning. It takes a lot of time on the instructor's part to get the course set up, because you do have to have it ready to go on day one, because it needs to be self-paced and ready to go. So it takes a lot of time to get it online, but once it's ready to go, it is set. This is something that's not manageable in face-to-face, because as we know, we sometimes need to sleep. So you are not available 24/7 like you are with a CAPSI. And finally, again, increased student satisfaction. It also increased student rates in our classes, as you could see, as well as with the data. So we were pretty excited about what we saw.
There's always room for improvement in our study methodology as we go forward to try and continue assessing this CAPSI method. For one thing, though we strove for diversity, having the stats course, the psychology course, the education course, as all of you are aware, we're still only covering a very small sort of area within the university area, just the area of education in general. Lots of different topics, biology, chemistry, et cetera, that could be looked into here and really should be looked into to determine whether or not CAPSI is sort of this blanket potential improvement or if it is best for certain types of content areas. So general areas, specific topics within those areas, and of course the type of course, looking further at sort of these not just writing-based courses, but say courses that are specifically teaching writing as content versus just using writing as an assessment tool versus the sort of traditional content-based courses. Something else that we need to sort of point out, based on this between subjects design and the fact that we did this over sort of a compressed time frame at this point, the terms during which the assessments were done were different terms, so at different times of year. So it's not like we're comparing winter students with traditional versus winter students with CAPSI, but rather it could be, say, a summer class versus a fall class, or a winter class versus a spring class, or something like this. So again, there might be some factors in there as far as, motivation and the type of student that signs up for courses at different times that we might need to take into account and might be sort of muddying the results that we're looking at. So ideally moving forward, we would want to be able to compare the exact same type of term across our groups of students. Again, in spite of the fact that we used 3 classes, our sample size is still relatively small. If we could get some of these, 400 student mega courses or something like that, do a lot to bump up our power and make us feel a lot more confident in some of the results we're looking at. Also, we kind of took almost a shotgun approach here. We took what we thought were the key elements of CAPSI, applied them as best we could within the term structure, and just said, overall, do we see an improvement? But really, there's a lot of different things to potentially unpack that CAPSI is made up of. There's the self-pacing, the multiple assessments, the feedback, the multiple materials, and each of these things could theoretically be tested by itself over a period of time to see which elements are actually necessary or if it's necessary to have them all together. All right. And then, of course, based on the type of assessment, the type of teaching that you're doing, the type of feedback that you're giving, it might be good to sort of break that down a little bit more in detail. All right. So before we open it up for questions, as Robert reminded me, we want to acknowledge that this was supported in part by the educational development grants that we received to work on this during the summer, so we wouldn't want that to go unrecognized. All right, any questions?
Great job, everyone. Best friends. Good job. I actually several questions I was thinking about, and then you addressed them. But one of the questions I have is, this seems like a relatively very hands-off approach. So I'm curious about the interaction you actually have with your students, if any, outside of the front loading. I know that that's a lot of course design that happens, but if everything's very automated, then I'm curious about that interaction. And then I do have a follow-up after that, but I'll let you do that first.
So in my courses, everything was video, so they always had videos of me teaching the materials or providing the reviews or the introduction to what they were going to be learning. But also, I had a lot of my students emailing, asking questions throughout, verifying information, and just saying, I'm not really sure, even though my feedback said this, really what does this mean? So in that way, I think students had a lot more access. Because it was 24/7, they could always email and get that immediate response. So for me, that's how I was always involved with those students.
And just a side note, I ran a previous CAPSI study before this one. And in that study, part of the assessment measures, we're looking at the rate of emails from the students coming in and interacting. And we had about 2.1, if my memory's right. I know it's like 2 point small number, times more emails from the students in the CAPSI than we did in the traditional distance education lecture course. So they're actually, from that measure, engaging more. So.
And I guess, yeah, I can just add to that. Similar sort of experience. The engagement, with the students still making those video lectures, they're still getting sort of that face-to-face, I guess you could say. But then as far as communication with the students goes, I still make regular announcements based on how the students are doing on major assignments, based on reminders. So that's that same level that I would have in the traditional course. And then again, same sort of thing really, as a lot of you are probably aware in the online courses, we rely a lot on the students to reach out to us because we can't sort of grab them right there. And I would say that the students were emailing just as often within the CAPSI course. I didn't notice any particular difference.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think a lot of times there's a misconception that, well, then we don't need anybody to teach the class at all. It could just be automated. So I think it's important to address that. The second piece I have is about the writing feedback, because if they're doing writing and it's automated feedback, how is that personalized to the strengths and weaknesses of the individual learner?
Okay, so I didn't explain that well. So the students, one of the major projects is the book review. And because it is a writing course, they have to do multiple drafts of that information. So I gave them feedback and my students gave them feedback. But in regards to CAPSI, everything was content-based. So that's the difference there. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions?
Not a question, just a comment. Back in the 80s, in the Stone Age, when I went to Portland State, and they did something similar to this. They had a masteries-based math course. So like Math 111, there would be eight quizzes over the term, and there would be about 8 versions of the quiz. And so students would not take it in class. They would go to a testing center, and the testing center would grade. And if they didn't get a certain percent, like I think it was like 70 or something, then what they would do is you just don't qualify to take the next test. And then you have I think it was like a 2 or 3 day cool down period where you had to study, and then you got another opportunity, and you got several cracks at this, but you couldn't go on until. So anyway, I thought that was a really great idea. I would have loved to do it here, but you have to have a testing center kind of dedicated to that, which you have to have really large courses for that. But it'd be interesting to do something like that in math, computer automated.
And just a side note for the math perspective, in the stats course, that's always been a difficult one for psych majors, right? And if you're looking percentage-wise, on the exams they performed 11% better in the CAPSI model. And where I'm really excited is those students who did CAPSI, about half of my capstone students currently in the psychology capstone had it as CAPSI, and about half of them had it as the distance education model. And I'm seeing a big difference. And in the capstone course, this has actually been my best term ever in regards to their methods section and understanding what they're doing with stats. So I have, I think it's 16 groups doing capstone right now. And this term, every single group except for 2 had their stats right. And they wrote down, these are the stats we need to do, this is why we need to do them. I'm like, they're right, yay! So I'd like to think that's CAPSI based. I can't tell for sure, but I know from their tests that it's starting to sink in when to do what stat and why they're doing what stat. So I'm optimistic.
And I was excited about the results in my course comparing my students from term to term, or when I teach this course. My students really had a stronger grasp of the content. As part of the writing course, we need to have all these things. Our students were doing a lot of motivationally based writing. Tell us 3 things you learned, 2 more things you want to learn about, 1 question you have. But with this type of strategy, I really knew my students knew the content. So I'm feeling more secure as my students go out that they really have that understanding more. So I was excited.
Apparently it's now time for me to say that I'm also excited. No, actually, I really liked this setup. I think that additionally it gives us sort of maybe a quicker opportunity to see where exactly students are at. You know, by giving them multiple attempts on these quizzes, we can get a better idea of did they just flub one of these, or are they really struggling with that particular area? And so what I've actually done is I took those quizzes and just sort of Frankensteined them into my on-campus research methods course. So it's not a full CAPSI model, but I do believe at least pieces of this are valuable enough that you can sort of take them and place them even outside of the CAPSI situation.
I have one question. Rhea, I know that oftentimes you have the same students in multiple classes, so they've been probably exposed to your more traditional setup. Did you see them having any difficulty with wrapping their head around this different method of obtaining the content?
No, in fact, I had a lot of them thanking me for this opportunity because it was self-paced. If students were going away on trips or going somewhere, they could do the work prior, where previously it was, can you open the module earlier? Can you send me the work early? Because all of my other courses were done by weeks because I want them to stay on track and not procrastinate. But I also don't want them working too far ahead. So this actually alleviated that piece where it was a concern if they were doing something. If something comes up like a sickness in our students' lives, it doesn't throw them behind. They don't get zeros for not turning something in time because of sickness. It just allowed them the time to continue in doing what they need to do on their time frame. So actually my students really appreciated it, and I actually had a couple ask if we could do it more in the early childhood program. So interesting.
In your courses prior to CAPSI, did you have anything where the students were interacting with each other? And if so, when you move to CAPSI, do you lose that interaction because they're self-paced, and do you think you've lost anything by losing that interaction if that's what happens?
I'll go first. I kept all of my pieces in there, so they still had to do introductions with each other. They still had to have conversations with each other. They just had this in addition to those pieces. So just like in my courses, they would have some sort of a writing assignment and a discussion board. They were still doing that discussion board. It just switched to a content celebration of knowledge.
My course being stats, there's not a whole bunch of collaboration. I still have my little discussion board for them to talk to each other, but I never require them to do that. And I have my find a study buddy thing that I have up there, but in all the years of teaching, only 2 students have ever found a study buddy through my study buddy link. So nature of the course. Same.
Just mine.
Maybe this is redundant. Just confirming, you didn't see any difference in participation in the online forums?
Discussion boards, nope, because it was still part of the required pieces that they still had to do. Okay. They just had more time to do it. So I wasn't monitoring and giving grades for, did you do your initial post on time? Did you respond to 2 peers on time? It was more of content that they were doing versus administration. So okay. Actually, again, it goes back to talking about I think my students really grasped the material stronger because I was grading on content versus administration of assignments.
Okay.
There was one thing that I did notice, and I've noticed it more this current term than the previous one, is that some of the students really have a hard time adjusting. So all of my courses are laid out in very similar format. So my students are very used to how my courses are set up. And then this one, even though I send out an email, and I send out a video, and I send out all this material saying, it's different, this is how it is, this is what you need to do, there's still a couple students who have really struggled this term, particularly 2 of them. And I've sent them emails saying, hey, remember this course is different. You need to be doing it this way. Hey, you're still not getting it. Can we set up a phone call? Call up their phone from the list. Hey, this is your professor. We need to talk about how to do this course. You're not quite getting it yet. And unfortunately, one of those students just dropped last week, and the other one's not on track to pass, which I don't know if they would have with the other method, but those 2 students have really struggled with wrapping their minds around this different approach, even though the material's there to explain it.
Just a thought. I guess you're already kind of doing some, well, you're requiring, participation in the online forums, but I was wondering if you'd given thought to maybe gamifying that. You'll have students that will plow ahead and students that won't. And I wonder if like some kind of incentive for the students that have plowed ahead to answer questions from the laggers.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I didn't utilize that, didn't think about it. I found most of my students either were always ahead, or the ones that I always anticipated being behind were always behind. So it was pretty consistent, but they always ended. I felt like they ended early and felt really good about what they learned versus that push towards exam week and I have to get my final project done. I kind of felt like they started their final projects earlier than they would have.
So I think I'm asking you to predict. The next generation to me seems that there might be implications for using this mastery model outside the constraints of what we normally look at in terms of our terms, whereas a student who wants to pace and go more rapidly could finish a degree in 2 years. A student who needed to work slower could do that in 6 years, et cetera. What are your opinions about the implications for that?
Well, I think we addressed this a little bit in sort of how PSI itself sort of failed for a given period of time based on, I think there's the question of how do you charge students under that model and how do you reimburse the faculty under that model. And I think that you would have to get that piece figured out definitely. If you could just decide to charge by the course, that's fine for the student, but if you're going to allow them to keep taking the course past the term, then I think there needs to be something in place to provide basically additional monies to the person who is continuing to support that student. So possible if, say, an administration was willing to make that kind of that change. It would also be a question as to whether or not the students are willing to potentially pay more to offset that, I would say. As far as the sort of speeding up the learning and things like this, again, to the degree that the professors are available and able, that they have the time, the FTE, whatnot, to address these students that are speeding through, I think that that would definitely be a possibility in the future.
And I'm kind of torn on this because I was that student who did my degree in 2 years. And the traditional model drove me nuts. I'm like, come on, you're going so slow, let's speed this up. And I would have loved this personally. But then there's also something to be said for all those other experiences that you're having when you force students to slow down, even the students who can do it at a faster time frame. So I think this could be an amazing model to go forward, but I think there are a lot of issues, not just logistical with the university and pay and those type of things to figure out, but also just what's actually going to lead to the best development of our students when we're considering that we're not just here to teach the explicit content, but the latent content of an education, and how do we make sure they still get that. So I can see there being some definite benefits, but some real drawbacks as well.
I think it would depend on the content and what you're teaching, because I've seen firsthand what happens when we have students who are significantly younger trying to complete our degree and their level of readiness to be in the classroom as a teacher at 20 as opposed to 22. So I think that speeding up, I think it's going to depend on what the course of study is and what they need in order to be able to accomplish what they need to do effectively. And the experiences that sometimes happen that aren't planned when you're forced to slow down, I think are really important. So just my response to your question on that.
Any other questions?
I would just say, with AAOTs happening in high school, we're already seeing students come through our programs, and to do a tier program, that's teetering on the edge of having an 18 or 19-year-old high school teacher. So that's really concerning, I would say. So I think it depends on your population. Certainly second career folks or folks coming back at a different age of 16 to 18 might be a different story, but it's somewhat terrifying to me to see an 18-year-old high school teacher.
And just a side note, where I'm taking this currently is I'm going back and I'm putting in remedial things into my stats course, which I really like that I can do that now. So in the past, if a student doesn't know how to calculate an average, I'm like, oh, you should know how to calculate this, go take another class. Now I'm able to put in a unit and say, hey, go back and learn how to calculate an average. So I feel like it's really nice for the remediation as well.
Well, we have reached 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation, and thank you to our presenters. Wonderful, thanks.